This video was sponsored by Dragon Slayers Credentialing and Consulting and Ask Fred. Hey guys, it's Cyrus of Chaos. So this week, the FIE announced one of the biggest changes to fencing equipment in decades. Starting on March 15th, every fencing manufacturer in the world will have to pay new annual licensing fees, product fees, and even a fee for every single piece of equipment they sell. The FIE says that this is about safety and authenticity, but after speaking directly with equipment manufacturers, the reality may be much bigger and potentially more controversial than most fencers actually realize. So let's start with what we actually know. According to the official document, which is now being displayed on screen, manufacturers must now pay an annual licensing fee of 5,000 Swiss francs. Swiss francs are roughly equivalent to euros, so I might accidentally use those terms interchangeably throughout the video, but I mean Swiss francs every time I do say euros by accident. 2, 5,000 francs per product category per year, up to a maximum of 25,000 francs. So if you are selling one piece of equipment, it's just an additional 5,000 a year. If you're selling 4 pieces of equipment, it's an additional 20,000 a year. If you're selling 5 or more pieces of equipment, it's an additional 25,000 per year. And then there's also, per piece of FIE equipment, there will need to be an FIE label provided by the FIE on each of these pieces of equipment, and that label will cost 350 francs. So those things can add up pretty quickly, but essentially what this means is that all previous equipment approvals are canceled and have to be renewed. So if you had permission to sell FIE equipment, you don't anymore until you pay these fees again. And all equipment from companies that don't pay a fee will not be accepted at FIE competitions. It's still not clear how this affects things from before this. So for example, if, just using a random example, like if you bought an All-Star white jacket and they don't renew or they can't renew, is your All-Star stuff that you bought before this goes into effect invalid? I really don't know. And that's something that the equipment vendors don't know either. So to understand why this announcement is causing such a strong reaction from the manufacturers, it helps to understand how FIE equipment approval worked up until now. So historically, FIE homologation was primarily a technical certification process, not a licensing system, meaning that manufacturers first had to meet European safety standards, things like CE certification and CE in testing, which already required independent laboratory verification of puncture resistance materials and construction. After that, the equipment was submitted to the FIE semi-committee, the technical body responsible for equipment standards. Products were evaluated, tested when necessary, and if they met the requirement, they were added to the official list of approved equipment. In practical terms, approval was tied to whether the equipment met safety standards, not to ongoing payments based on how much equipment a company sold. Manufacturers paid for testing and certification, but there was generally no annual participation license and no per item fee attached to protective equipment and used in competition. The distinction matters a lot because the new framework does not simply update testing procedures, it introduces recurring licensing fees and a payment attached to every FIE labeled item sold. The FIE states that these changes are intended to improve safety, oversight, and prevent counterfeit equipment, which are real concerns within the sport. However, the shift also represents a structural change where approval is no longer only about passing technical standards, but also about maintaining paid registration within the FIE system. Whether intentional or not, this moves fencing equipment regulation from a purely compliance-based model towards a licensed certification model, and that is why manufacturers see this as more than just an administrative update. So according to several equipment manufacturers that I've spoken with directly who described their understanding of the process, major brands were informed late in 2025 that these changes were coming in a meeting that was held with several major manufacturers only. Companies were asked in this meeting what fees they believed were reasonable and sustainable for them, and the numbers that were discussed were apparently much lower than what was actually sent out at the end of February. And the final pricing that was only confirmed at the end of February, just weeks before the implementation, kind of blindsided these manufacturers. Like, they were all very surprised after what they discussed to be receiving these things, and then with such a small amount of time in order to actually pay these fees back. So in other words, companies say that they had almost no time to adapt to a completely new financial structure, and the FIE has not publicly commented on these specific claims at the time of the recording of this video. And this matters more than it might initially sound like it would. So what this means economically for us, the consumer, translated into real numbers, a mid-sized fencing company could now pay roughly 5,000 francs for the licensing fee, which is mandatory. If that company is selling 5 different FIE products, they would have to pay an additional 25,000 francs for the 5 or more different category fees. Then, assuming that a large company like All-Star or Absolute or PBT or Leon Paul is selling 20,000 of individual pieces of equipment per year, those 20,000 stamps, which they have to buy before selling a single piece of equipment to put on each of their jackets and gloves and plastrons and etc. that have to have those stamps, that would cost 70,000 francs as well. So you're looking at a 100,000 franc price tag for these companies before they've even sold anything. And I think that the big guys would even exceed 100,000 in some cases. So for the large companies, that would be painful but manageable, but for the small companies, that's completely unsustainable. And some of the ones that I've talked to on the phone since this came out think that this may mean that they'll either have to sell a lot less equipment or that they may just straight go out of business. So the likely long-term effects of this, well, whether intentional or not, policies like this tend to have the predictable consequences of 1, higher barriers to entry for anyone who is looking to get into the sport because all of this equipment will now be more expensive, fewer manufacturers, which means that equipment will be less readily available in developing fencing countries, higher prices for athletes because these costs rarely stay with the manufacturers. And if you just assume that the new tag price will raise it, every single piece of equipment will cost at least 3 francs and 50 franc cents more expensive than it used to. But they're probably going to increase the prices even more to compensate for the fact that they're now losing 30,000 francs at the beginning of each season. And then as far as market consolidation goes, large established brands become relatively stronger. And several of the manufacturers told me that they fear this policy could significantly reduce competition in fencing equipment, which, if you're removing the ability for all the smaller brands to compete, it certainly will. The FIE argues that these fees will fund testing for the equipment to make sure that it's up to their standards, authentication to show that each of these pieces of equipment has a patch that only they produce so it can't be counterfeited, and to be clear, counterfeit safety equipment is a real concern, especially in a sport like fencing where you need to meet minimum safety requirements and you can't cut corners there. But the question many manufacturers are asking is, do these fees match the actual cost of testing? Industry sources say that independent certification testing is typically a fixed laboratory cost rather than an ongoing per item royalty. So critics argue that this looks less like testing reform and more like a new licensing system for them. So some figures within fencing governance have been discussed in industry conversations surrounding the policy. At the moment, I have not found publicly verifiable evidence linking any FIE officials to specific equipment manufacturers commercially, but the lack of transparency around how these fees were determined is becoming a major concern among suppliers. And when a governing body both regulates a market and directly collects revenue from it, people naturally start asking questions. So why should this matter to the fencers? Well, this isn't just about industry politics. It affects the price of masks and uniforms, equipment availability, innovation of new products, which would then have to be tested for this outrageous fee, and ultimately who can afford to participate in fencing, which is already a sport that's quite expensive. And a smaller equipment ecosystem means fewer choices and potentially even higher costs worldwide. So on to the bigger question. The real issue isn't whether safety standards should exist. Everyone agrees that they should, again, obviously in a sport where things can go wrong like fencing, but the question is, has fencing moved from safety certification to monetizing certification? And if so, who benefits, who pays, and who decided this? This policy takes effect on March 15th. Its real impact won't be visible immediately, but over the next few years, or even as soon as like a few months from now, you will definitely see changes, including higher prices, and it could even mean a reshaping of the entire fencing equipment industry, as some equipment vendors can no longer afford to sell products that they were selling previously. Some will go out of business entirely, and we won't know the effects of that until months or even years down the road, but there will be a major change to this. And now for a few quick summarizing thoughts of my own. So first, something that these equipment vendors wanted me to clarify explicitly: this is not a ploy by equipment manufacturers to raise their prices. They were completely blindsided by this announcement and are the most unhappy out of everyone that they're gonna have to pay these fees. Two, this video is based on publicly available documents and conversations with industry participants where opinions or projections are discussed. They represent analysis rather than statements of intent or wrongdoing. Three, if representatives from the FIE would like to clarify or respond, I'm very happy to include their perspectives in a future update, but nobody I've reached out to had anything meaningful to say, or in most cases just chose not to respond to me. And if you work in equipment manufacturing or have information on how this policy was developed or how you think it will affect you, please feel free to contact me privately. And that's all I got for today. So thank you for everything. Like and subscribe here and pledge on Patreon, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.